Hi guys, I'm back. I think I
I
just
know.
lost connection for a while. Yeah.
No, I think all of us did.
Acha, the whole call got.
Yeah. Everyone
Okay.
did.
Just 1 second.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, it shows we're live now.
Yeah, we're back live on YouTube. We can
Okay.
continue, Anupa. This will go as a different feed, but it's okay.
Okay.
We can unify them later. We can
Sure,
edit
sure.
them.
No, but other folks, everyone's there, right? Yeah.
Um,
Okay. So sorry, guys. Sorry for the interruption. Let's get back. Yeah. So yeah, I was talking about Silk Roads, and I think it's a good one if you have an interest in understanding events with respect to each other. So one of the things I liked about this book is it talks of a lot of events and kind of talks about the impact of one something happening in one part of the world, how it has influenced the other part of the world. And one of the key points he makes is, he says that in common history or in popular history, a lot of times the focus given is what the Western world has given the Eastern world, right? But in this particular book, he gives a lot of or an equal focus to what the Eastern world has also given the Western world, and how ultimately every history has an equal impact, but just that the way the history is written kind of influences what we believe. Right. So he digs deep into a lot of things that haven't been uh, in the uh, in the forefront of history writing per se. Right. So in that sense, yes, it makes for a good but in-depth and yeah, a little bit of heavy read. Whereas that's where I was talking about a book like *Sapiens* makes history much more lighter. It allows you to read through it in a lighter manner. Right. No, that's what I'm saying. It just creates an interest to read more if you really want to. Right. The research is not quoted in that context. This is extremely well researched. Okay, so yeah, moving on. Anyone else? Sanit, would you like to talk about something? Any books or any chronicles, any books that you've read about history?
I
Okay.
think the uh,
Oh, we still can't hear Sanket. Can you just come closer to the mic?
yeah. Um, Coming closer home, if you look at the Indian history, um, and I also noticed that you have a man of
I think it's still a bit unclear. I'm sorry.
I
You
think you
still.
know what, just move this and
Yeah.
take the laptop.
is this better?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah. In the context of Indian history, of course, Indian history is also, a lot of controversies, around, Marxist historians versus right-wing history and rewriting and so. But I think, at least, I mean, I have a limited experience with history, but within that, I think the best book on Indian history that I have found so far is John Key's, India a History. It's a quite a thick book, more than 600 pages. Um, and I think so. What I really like about that, and in general books that talk about history, is uh, a sense of, of course, everyone comes with a little bit of bias. Obviously, it's hard to remove that, but it's, is it, it's more about how much caution do you, bring into the way you approach a topic, right? So what John Key does is he takes, a very in-depth view, but he also cites a lot of research work. He also basically wherever wherever there are things that are not clear, he sort of clearly calls those out that this is speculative and so on. So there is very little speculation overall in that work. And the other really good thing I liked about this particular book is if you a lot of the books that cover Indian history, the focus is heavily towards the northern part of India, right? So it's the Guptas, the Mauryas, and so on. But Rajaraja Chola gets a mention in passing. A lot of, whereas you have this great empire, and that's not only built an entire shipping enterprise, but then went and influenced Southeast Asia. But that's not that's usually not covered at all, right? Or something like the Hoysalas or the Rashtrakutas, who sort of crossed the Deccan Plateau and had a huge empire, the Vijayanagar kingdom and so on. So in that sense, John Key's book does a fairly comprehensive coverage, and even 600 pages is nothing for a topic like Indian history, but does a very good job of all of this, starting from the prehistory, of course, and that's especially where he is quite cautious, because prehistory is always more greater source of controversy, like I was mentioning, in the absence of documentation and so on. But he covers a lot of other so basically he sort of gives a good importance to all the major dynasties across in the Indian geography, right? So that's really good. And of course, it's a very enjoyable book as well. He brings enough humor into all of into the entire writing. Right. So yeah. So that's a book I'd highly recommend. And I'm sure somebody would want to talk about either this or even the Land of the Seven Rivers. I'll come back to that later once someone else.
So just a quick note on John Key's book. Towards the end of the book, he also has a chapter on the Bhopal Gas Tragedy. So I agree with
this is the book you were talking about. No,
That's the title of the chapter.
Right. So I agree with what Sanket said. It's a rather humorously written book and makes the history of India quite approachable. But he also is great at bringing in a sense of dejection and a sense of irony. That chapter on the Bhopal gas tragedy is titled "Midnight's Grandchildren," and it's really painful to read that chapter. Highly recommended book.
Right. So on that note, maybe it's time to get into the history of India. Right. I mean, we've covered the world history, few books. I know there are so many more out there. Like we were saying, it can get very heavy, this topic of history and research-based writing, which contains so much of data. But we also have other historians and who do write about it in a slightly lighter vein. In that case, yes.
Anupa, maybe turn the laptop towards yourself because we're kind of looking you.
Yeah, is that clear now?
This is better, yes.
Yeah. Okay. So like I think Samyan's Land of Seven Rivers is a much lighter read and takes you breezing through certain parts of Indian history, like he titles it, "The Brief History of Indian Geography." Right. So on that note, I know that many of you have also been waiting to discuss Dalrymple, right? Specifically, there are of course others also, but I know for a fact that people have been waiting to discuss Dalrymple. So maybe the Dalrymple fans can give it a go.
Very few people are as Indian as William Dalrymple.
Wait, what? What did he say?
Well, he lives in New Delhi.
New Delhi. He's got a farmhouse there.
Yeah.
He's made India home now, right?
Sorry?
He's made India home, I said.
Yeah, and he is one of the directors of the India's largest literature festival, Jaipur. Directed by him. So.
Yes, Adi, go ahead with the City of Genes. She's been waiting.
Go ahead.
No, so this is my
Show off.
yeah, sure. So this is my there's a show off thing which this is a signed copy. Mandar got it signed.
Oh.
Ah, right. That was the show off. Okay, nice. Right.
So,
And he says happy birthday. That is the
no, that's not
No?
happy
Oh,
oh that's
maybe we'll say that to you next month. Now come on with the book.
no he said happy birthday to her in her copy of Anarchy.
Okay.
So you read that on every birthday? Just asking.
He's just talking on her last birthday, Sanad. We'll see. Akhilesh.
Anarchy.
Yeah, exactly. I was about to say like anarchy on birthday. Yeah, well. No, so
Yeah.
this is my first book of Dal Rinpoche. This is my introduction to Dal Rinpoche, so to speak. So I'm gonna talk in two parts. One about Dal Rinpoche as a writing, and I have some of the not so popular opinion about this book that's in the second part. So he writes it really well. Like for me, non-fiction and especially history, and it's my very personal opinion that even as a student, I hated it. So I find it very difficult. And this good question Sanid asked, like, how do you consume so much of technically heavy books? If you're interested in the topic, you will take that effort. But like some of these things, if you, for example, history of Delhi, I have like if it would have been about history of Bangalore, I would have like taken notes, researched about it, visited those places because I have that vested interest about the topic. But history of Delhi is something I just wanted to read out of intellectual curiosity and more to get to know Dal Rinpoche as a writer and not so much about Delhi. So I didn't make as much effort, but there were some interesting parts on it. So I'll come to that. But yeah, so the point I was making, like things like the way Harari writes or way Dal Rinpoche has written, it's very easy to read. They have converted it into sort of a story format. And the way he tells history is not like simply facts, but he has actually spoken to many people. He narrates their anecdotes and then starts linking it to some of the facts and the research he has done. So that makes it easy to read for somebody like me who is not so much into history per se. I think these are the books I like to read. Some of the heavy books probably I'll not be able to enjoy them as reading. It will still sound like a homework given by the teacher, history teacher sort of. So from that way, I think now I want to read more of Dal Rinpoche for sure. Now coming to the book, I think I'll talk about the things which I like. So there are some of these anecdotes. For example, this is again like I've just last 10% of the book remaining. There is there's a story I read just about Hasina Pakiza Begum or someone of that name. She's officially recognized by Indian government as the descendant from Aurangzeb, basically, from that line. And he had a conversation with her, and I was very curious to know, like to say it in a very, very crass way. I wanted to know what do they think, like their ancestors. They did a lot of good for the country, but yeah, I mean, they also did not. They also sort of invaded this land. Come on. So what
Trying
is their
so hard to be politically right.
yeah, that's why I said I'm not going to be politically right when I'm talking about this. So I wanted to know what is their opinion, right? Basically, so it was very interesting to know how they talk about it. So she points to there's a fort nearby where she stays right now. I think near Red Fort probably, and then she talks about it and says that hey, this is where we should be saying, and my great grandfathers bungled up basically. If they wouldn't have, we probably would have been one of the recognized dynasties still in India, in the sense, in the current context, and something on that sort. And they talk about Delhi as very fondly as their land, basically the city they built. Basically, that's the sense from that conversation I got. Like she misses that Delhi. The way Dal Rinpoche describes that whole meeting is he's taking a walk through the lane, and she says that I don't recognize these. These are some ruins or leftover of a city or something, and this is not Delhi which my ancestors built. And so it again, like a very wanted to know basically what was their view. It's a similar thing coming into a recent history basically. So there are a couple of families who were part of Raj's administration. They decided to stay back, and he went ahead and had a conversation with them. How is your life now? And the one thing they say that, hey, you know what, Raj promised us that we'll be here forever. But then what happened? Like they just left, and now we are left behind. Like they made a promise to us sort of, and then he moves on and asks them, so what do you think about this place now? And then they say that, hey, you know what, like these people are free, but I don't see them having as much of a they're not very proud of their history. They're not taking care of Delhi the way we took care of it. Again, like, you might have your own personal opinions the way I have about that conversation, but it's interesting to know how people from different race, people from different countries, people from a varied background has come together to make Delhi what we see today and what Delhi was, and how everybody feels attached to it as their own homeland. So that one sentiment is what clearly comes out of this book, and that is something I really like. And why I said an unpopular opinion is sort of, I think probably intentional. The way Dal Rinpoche has written, it's one thread or one lens of Delhi ka history of Delhi basically. It typically starts from the Mughal era, and anything and everything he describes, it starts going back and linking to it. That this is what has happened in Mughal times, or this is what that king built, and now this is how it has progressed. It doesn't really talk about what was there today, what was there in the times of Lodhis or before that. Basically, the way he has spoken about it is, when Mughal kings or their dynasty entered India, that's when history of Delhi started, and it ended with when British Raj left. And what we have today is not the history. It's whatever. That's a different story. So that is something I was not very, like, I didn't like that opinion as much, but maybe that's my interpretation, because I personally think India is like one fascinating country in the sense that there are so many cultures which has come together to make what it is today. So when you view a history of India or history of a place like Delhi in specific, you should consider all the angles. But yeah, like I said, in one book, you can't cover as much. So probably he just covered that one thread. And if I want to know more about Delhi, I'd probably look up to a couple of those lenses, and then decide for myself that, oh, this is how history of Delhi looks like, basically. But yeah, coming back to Dal Rinpoche, I think I'm looking forward to picking up a couple of more of his books. That's pretty much on this.
It wouldn't be an understatement to say she was livid when she read this book.
Yeah, I mean, there were some parts where I was like, how? This is not what it is. Like, how can you say it only belongs to Mughals, and that you can't credit everything to them? But yeah, like that's on the lighter part. Definitely a good read.
Was your anger at Dal Rinpoche, or was it
No.
the lady that he was speaking to?
No, not really at Dal Rinpoche. Like I said, right? Like, again, when you read a history of any place, it cannot be an isolation of just one, particular thing you follow. So it's all on the lighter note. It's completely up to you as what do you want to read. Why are you reading that history? I think it comes down to that. Do you want to know the facts? Do you want to know the stories? What do you want to know out of it, right? So yeah that's it comes down to that. But as I said, Dal Rinpoche as a writer, I don't have anything against. I think he has done a wonderful job.
Right. Before we go ahead, there's two people I can see, Manu and the next person who identifies himself or herself as iPhone, who've joined in later.
I see Manu twice. Maybe he's also joining on the phone.
Yeah, so we haven't heard from them yet. So guys, would you like to say something, join in, maybe introduce yourself to the group, because I think you guys have joined in later after we've started, so we've missed the initial part.
Hi, Manu.
Yeah.
Well, I actually was just wanting to be a part of this, so I didn't know what the discussion is about. I just saw the event on, I think, BMS or Insider.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm just an admirer of history and not really a reader.
Okay. So Manu, this group it's a kind of a book club where we discuss books on different themes every month. Okay, and this month the theme happens to be history with nonfiction, and each of us discuss the books on that particular theme, which we would have either read or and which we would like to read, which we've heard about. So it's an open discussion about books pertaining to a particular theme, right? So is there any book or something you would like to talk about on history that you've read?
No, as I said, I have not read history, but yeah, I want to know, like, do you decide beforehand before the discussion, as
We-
in like which books to discuss? And
we don't discuss this, we don't decide the specific books, but we do decide the theme. So today, once this session ends, within a couple of days, we usually float the theme on our WhatsApp group. Okay, so we do have a WhatsApp group which you
Okay.
can join if you're interested once the session is over.
okay,
They'll send you a link if you've registered your phone number. And then we float the theme there a month before. So it's not, sometimes it could be author specific or sometimes it could be thematic. Right.
Okay.
And then through the month we read or whatever we would have read before. In the session, then we discuss regarding that theme. And like it's obvious, this time the theme is history, which we discussed last month. Right. So books that are being discussed today will be pertaining to history at every, history in every way.
great. I would
So
love to
you-
be part of that WhatsApp group.
Definitely. So I'll ask the dialogues people to send you a link after the session is over.
Okay,
Right?
fine.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much.
And there's someone identifies as iPhone. Okay. So would you like to say something? Can we have a name that we can call you by? All right. Alay, coming back to you. Alay has been waiting to talk about Dal Rinpoche. So yes, Alay.
Yeah,
space
I
is
mean,
yours.
say what we will about Dal Rinpoche. I mean, he's just he's got a flair of writing. I mean, he's just got a way of writing. I've been reading this one. I'm not even like halfway through. This one is Anarchy by Dal Rinpoche. And I think Adi, a huge part of what you were saying with relating things to Mughal and the Raj is, I think, because that's where Dal Rinpoche's research and his forte lies, because he sort of specializes in that, and that is what he talks about. So I think it sort of makes sense that he relates everything to that. Yeah, I don't know if we should expect a lot from our historians. I don't know how this works, but yeah, there's one particular thing that he's saying. Like, I mean, in Anarchy, he's sort of talking about how the East India Company entered India, what was the state of India at that time, and then how they sort of managed to, grow their presence and ultimately become this ruler of this whole nation, stretch of massive nation. Because when they entered India, India was like so much more populous, so much more, I'd say, luxurious, and like, we just had so much more than back home England, whatever they had. So like some of the first peoples that came to India, they were just like completely stunned. They like boggled looking at the, like they just dazzled looking at this whole luxury and all of these empires and kings and Mughals and all of that. And he says this in the beginning only. It's always a mistake to read history backwards. We know that the East India Company eventually grew to control almost half the world's trade and become the most powerful corporation in history, as Edwin Burke famously put it, a state in the guise of a merchant. In retrospect, the rise of the company seems almost inevitable, but that was not how it looked in 1599. For at its founding, few enterprises could have seemed less sure of success. So then he goes from there and just sort of lays the groundwork of what the situation in England was at that time, and how they came eventually, and made their presence with the French people came, and the Dutch were there, and how they had internal wars going on back in Europe that they brought it to our shores, and so many other things. And it's just a great read. I have another book. I mean, I don't really have a lot to comment on the Anarchy. I mean, except for the fact that Dal Rinpoche just writes beautifully. I mean, it's heavy, but he just writes extremely beautifully. I mean, I have another book, but yeah, I mean, since Akhilesh wants to talk about Dal Rinpoche, I can go after him.
Yes, Akhilesh.
Okay, so yeah, I think I've also started to I've wanted to read Anarchy, and I also started to read City of Jinns.
Nice.
And I also like to read. I've also written a few things about the last Mughal. I think that was one of his also book on the Mughal Empire. So I think he has, as Ale mentioned, that's his area of research. So that's why probably we can expect him to write more about the subject. And I think he has a fascination with the Mughal era, with the Raj and what happened. I think that's why his accounts are quite vivid and quite fascinating to read. And it comes from a person who's not who's an outsider technically, but I think he's more Delhiite than many Delhiites are right now. Um, I want to talk about this City of Gems because I just started reading it. It's quite different from what he's written in the other books because it talks about people with in their lives and tries to make a connection with the Mughal era, I guess, again because that's his area. But he's not talking about a lot of how history has spanned, like how, for example, in Anarchy, how the Raj is coming up and eventually taking over, and what he talks about in the last Mughal, the fall of the Mughal Empire, the fall of Zafar, and the 1857 mutiny, and how it all ends and falls down on. I think he sympathizes with the king as well, the last Mughal as well on that, and probably he comes across as a very sorry figure too sometimes, because he's certainly a mascot, but he certainly is not powerful enough to lead the mutiny. At times, I've also felt that, and because he's also a poet, I have some sympathies with Zafar as well. But kidding aside, I think I like his writing a lot. His style of writing is pretty good. I think if you know, in a way, he makes reading history interesting as well. It's not because a lot of people complain that history is boring. I don't know how to read history. So many details, so many dates to remember. But yeah, his writing style is quite fascinating. So yeah, I look forward to read more Dalrymple. Hopefully, I'll try to finish
Yeah,
whatever
so
I've started.
I have read I think Last Mughal a long time back. So from what I remember is he had a style where he has set the scene, like he's almost uh, like providing a visual of a like a direct visual of the
Mm,
king and all, right, like
mm.
telling a story in
Right,
directly instead of just putting down some events,
right.
right? Like almost there's a narrative to the narrative structure to the entire book. That's what I remember reading.
Yeah, yeah, right.
Dalrymple seems to win the popularity contest today. Woke up a lot of people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nice. Last Mughal, anyone here has anything more to say about Last Mughal? Because I do think that was one of his most popular books at a point of time. I haven't though personally read it. Allah, have you read that, The Last
No,
Mughal?
no, no. This is also my first Dalrymple. Anarchy is.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
But just to add on the point where Aditi mentioned about Mughal and why he's talking about Mughal all the time, I think it's also a reflection of the city because a lot of the symbols in the city, a lot of structures in the city that are left behind are mostly from the era. So it's very easy to identify that with the city, and a lot of older ones have not either not survived or not in a very good shape as the Mughal structures are. And the best example is the Red Fort, which is still used as a symbol of power in the
Mm.
Indian democracy and the Indian Republic as well. Although it's it's a very Mughal era. It's sort of symbol of when Mughal era was probably at its most powerful during the Shah Jahan era. So yeah, I tend to relate to that. That yes, not everything about Delhi is about Mughal, of course. But if someone sees Delhi right now, it'll say, a lot of things does remind me of the Mughal era. A lot of structures does remind me of it. So that's probably how he views the city as well.
Right. Right. So, yeah, a look at the clock also reminds me that we're nearing the, we have maybe another 20 minutes to half an hour to go. And yeah, so
Anu, I need to leave. I want to talk about one book
Completely.
before that.
Yes, Alec, go ahead then.
Yeah, so this is not exactly history as such, but this is one of the finest journalism books, and it can be referred to, I think there's a chronicle of it's essentially the name of the book is Everybody loves a good drought. It's written by P. Sainath. P. Sainath is, I think, India's one of the most well-known, well-respected journalists. Is also won Magsaysay Award. The name of the book is Everyone Loves a Good Drought: Stories from India's Poorest Districts. So the premise is that he goes to the some of the poorest districts of India, and then basically he just says the anecdotes, like experiences and everything that he has seen, and sort of contrasts it with the statistics that have been provided by the government at that time. Books, I think fairly old. I think it was done in 1996, but yeah, it sort of still holds up to an extent. So I just want to read like a small excerpt from it. This is just introduction, and he's talking. The title of the chapter is "Harvesting the Third Crop." He says, one of the first things people who have read Everybody Loves a Good Drought ask me, how did you come to give this book its name? So this is a new introduction in the newer edition. So yeah, so everyone asked me, how did you come to give this book its name? I didn't. I just grabbed the idea from Ramji Lakhan. He was a peasant activist who organized agricultural laborers to fight for their rights in Palamu, then in Bihar, now in Jharkhand. We have a great drought going on here, he told me. The big people are making much money out of it, and the block development officer, BDO, has gone to harvest the third crop. I was mystified. I know of the Kharif crop harvested in autumn after the rainy season, and I know of the Rabi sown in winter and harvested in spring. But what is this third crop? Drought relief, said Ramji. He had been hoping I would ask. The money that comes in as relief makes the powerful richer than they were. It's quite a good business. We like a good drought here. He called the BDO the BTDO, which is block the development officer. No work takes place unless he gets his cut. But he did not use the term third crop in English. He said Tisri Fasal, and that remains the title of the Hindi edition of this book. So this is, I mean, apart from like the statistics and the personal stories, he's just extremely witty, and he's so sarcastic. He just there is a very sharp tone to his whenever he's describing some of the evidences or anecdotes that he's had, and whenever he's contrasting the like the positions taken by some of the politicians and the leaders, with big numbers that, oh, we've got 100% electricity, oh, we've got like every village has got like a water now, and so many other things, and people no longer, people below poverty line, their percentage has been decreasing. So many of the statistics which sort of very rosy pictures, but like when you go on the ground and look at what has happened, it's not, it doesn't hold up. The statistics don't really hold up over there. It's also a bit of a contrast because you've got like a overall numbers, and then he's also going to some of the poorest districts and getting individual stories. So none of this is to say that the overall numbers are wrong. It's just that with the stories, he wants to highlight that like how misleading the idea of notion of the whole solving a problem using numbers, like that whole idea itself might be flawed, or we might not consider every aspect of the problem in those solutions, and those solutions a lot of times create just other problems, and we never seem to talk about those. So he talks about those. He talks about the problems, the initial problems, and then the solutions to that, and then the problems that those solutions created, and so on. And he talks about the solutions that were made to sort of in rural areas, keeping the urban population in mind, because the politicians wanted PR from urban people. And he talks about the development done for the sake of development, done that no one really asked for. And at the end of it, it just ended up hurting the people that it was done around. He talks about the river projects, and he talks about some of the income yojanas that government puts out. He talks about agriculture plans and so many things, and so many of the failures. This looks like, I don't know, it's just, I've recently read it, but it's like very close to my heart, because it just shows you that and I mean, I deal with a lot with numbers in my daily life, but it just shows that how often you cannot rely on numbers, and like you need to know the stories behind those numbers, and each number does have a story behind it. So it's about those stories that are behind those numbers. I think it's a great read. Yeah, that's all from me. I think everyone.
Thank you, Alay. I know it shows how much that book has really, it's with you. I know you've been talking it about for a long time also, right?
Yeah,
This is the book that
That's
won him
nice.
the Magsaysay.
Sorry?
I think this is the book that won him. Yeah.
I was saying
This
this is the
is-
book that won him the award, I guess.
I would say this, that it is a bit dated because of course this was written in 1996 and he cannot obviously go back and revise every single number from that. But newer editions, he has tried to sort of add a postscript to all the chapters, saying what has sort of happened in this period. And surprisingly, a lot of them have not changed. Like at least not in the percentages, they've not really changed. So so yeah, it's a bit dated in that sense. But yeah, I think it should not be read as a as a state as of now. It should be read as the stories, like the state that used to be, and a lot of those ideas behind the stories and numbers are still very relevant.
Yeah, I'm sure a lot of the stories are still the same as well.
Yeah.
Right. So,
All right, I need to drop off. Anu, thanks a lot. Thank you guys.
yeah, thank
thanks
you,
a lot.
Alay. You're gonna miss the remaining part because
I know.
you
I
can
wanted to
catch
hear
up the
what Mandar
recording
was
later.
gonna say. But
Yeah. So moving on to those who haven't yet shared anything.
Yeah, because I like.
Mandar? Yeah, Sandeep, sorry.
Yeah. Yeah, it's okay. Just because I brought up this, story of journalism during a drought. There was a small, I did end up on a particular story which I thought nobody had heard. Like I didn't hear of this story. It was during Bengal famine in 1943. Uh, when at the peak of the Bengal famine, like the British Raj was not actually accepting that there was a famine itself. They were holding like I think there was a war happening between
World War
Burma. Yeah, right. Burma had to import grains and all, but it wasn't coming in, and the Britain public was not aware of such a famine happening in Bengal, and people were dying. And this is particular person called Ian Stephens. He wrote a book called Monsoon Mornings. He was a journalist for Statesman. So what he did is he wanted to report the famine, and so I read the book, but mostly I read this part. I was trying to make a small webcomic out of it. So because I found the story really fascinating. So what he did is he tried to report it to the government, and the government was not accepting it. Like they were saying that the famine does not exist, or it was not getting the kind of visibility to the public. So what he did is, and there was a emergency rule at that time which said that they cannot use the word famine, or there was a censorship on the press. So what he did is made a workaround out of it, and he just ran pictures out of pictures without any words. He started putting pictures of the famine, and it created such an uproar in the public, even in the London society. It became a key factor that to they started sending in a lot of relief, and it kind of saved a lot of lives. So it's like a story of a journalist. I think it's an unknown story. Later, I think Amartya Sen and all like really appreciated this person. I think he died around in 1980. He came back to Calcutta in 1970 or so, and the people still recognized him, this particular journalist, because at that time to go against that powerful government was difficult. So I felt that story of a journalist. Right now the journalism is also something which we need, and that's not the right way
Right.
happening. So I think
True.
that story fascinated me. Yeah. So just wanted
Thank
to add
you.
on because Ali said it.
Thanks, Sandeep, for the anecdote. Yeah, interesting. Yeah. Moving on, Shirisha, Mandar, Shreya, we haven't heard from you yet. Mandar, you want to talk about your book?
Yeah, let's just check if Shirisha or another person who was Shreya,
Yes.
if they want to talk about a book.
Shirisha, Shreya, yeah. Shirisha?
I did want to talk about one book. I am not very certain if it falls under this category exactly, but the book is called Caste by Isabel Wilkerson. I think she's popularly known for her book Warmth of Other Suns. I think that's a book she's very well known for. But the book is called Caste, and it kind of outlines three major global caste systems. One is the officially vanquished caste system of the Nazi Germany. One is the millennia-long caste system of India, and one more is the race-based caste system of the US. So she's done a lot of research in all of these countries, and she has it's a very well researched book, and it just talks about these similarities between all of these cultures. So which is what I really liked about the book, because as people, at least from India, we have seen caste something so internalized in our system from that perspective, and it kind of just talks about these parallels between all of these systems. I have a couple of excerpts that I would like to just read out. They're quite small. Just a second. Yeah. Sorry. So she introduces these three systems, and then she goes on to say, each version of the caste relied on stigmatizing those deemed inferior to justify the dehumanization necessary to keep the lowest ranked people at the bottom and to rationalize the protocols of enforcement. A caste system endures because it is often justified as divine will, originating from sacred text or the presumed laws of nature, reinforced throughout the culture and passed down through the generations. So, like I said, she draws a lot of parallels and she quotes some of these biblical texts, and she talks about Nazi Germany, where in all of these cultures, we kind of, there are these pillars of caste system, where one is maybe pollution, where one set of people are looked at, polluting another set of people, and then there, like I mentioned, there is the divine will, where people tend to believe that this kind of segmentation that we have is divine's will, that this is how it's meant to be, of sort. And while talking about these parallels, she talks about one thing, which is the resistance that the caste system has caused, and it's just a small paragraph, and I'd like to just read that. While doors have opened to the subordinated castes in India and America in decades since discrimination was officially prohibited, the same spasms of resistance have afflicted both countries. What is called affirmative action in the US is called reservation in India, and they're equally unpopular with the upper castes in both countries, language tracking in lockstep, with complaints of reserved discrimination in one and reverse casteism in the other. This kind of reminds me of like when we're discussing Sapiens. And while I did not agree with Sapiens as a whole, I thought the book was a little reductive. But what I found was really interesting was that he talks about this one point where even long before in the history where countries started to communicate with each other, we can find similar behavior across these cultures, whether it was discriminative behavior towards women, or this kind of segregation in our society, where we have this tendency to see that some people are somehow better than the other, whether it's in matriarchal society women have dominated, or in patriarchal society men have dominated. These kind of social structures that we have created has been long common before even we started interacting with other people. So it kind of just talks about our human tendency in general, and which is what I really liked about this book as well. She kind of explores this roots of system and how it's not just caste, where varna, where we have our that it is backed by religion in India and it is backed by races in US or Germany. So she just talks about similarities in all these countries, and I think it's a very beautifully outlined system of caste from a very outside perspective. So I think that parallelism in these caste systems, something that I really liked when I was reading this book.
That's a valid point. Yeah, quite interesting. That's also, yeah, caste does become, I mean, it does have its own significance in the history of the world as well as our country in a very strong way, right? Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Shirisha. Yeah, Mandar, is Mandar there? He said, I'll be back in 2 minutes. Okay, so I think Mandar is just offline for a while. So then maybe, Ankit, you wanted to talk about this till Mandar comes.
I mean, I just wanted to about the seven rivers did mention earlier. And I do have some problems with the book, but I'll first talk about what I really liked about certain parts. that I really liked about it is one particular thing. So one of the themes that Sanjay Sanyal explores here is, in fact, it's the title as well, a brief history of India's geography. Right. So he talks about how the geography sort of influenced, and he talks at length about the Aravallis in the north, and then the India side, how the physical boundaries and how how geography influences history, and the rivers, the different rivers, of course, and so on. But there's one particular chapter in this which really was very insightful for me. It's about the Great Trigonometric Survey of India. So the Great Trigonometric Survey of India is basically when the British sort of started this, sort of identifying and locating different places, and then the distances between different. Because in fact, the height of uh, Everest was also, sort of it was so the height of different mountain ranges, etc., was also part of that. So it was headed by this guy called Everest, which is why Mount Everest takes that name. But that's a quite a fascinating account of how that happened. Of course, in this book, of course, it is also quite speculative in other areas. So wherever Sanyal is talking about historical facts, and then making those observations, historical fact that is pretty solid in this book. Where he starts to bring in his own interpretation, and his own observations to things, that's where sort of this book starts failing, and yeah, he's sort of he wants to sort of force fit certain narrative into those facts, and then he tries very hard to sort of show how the Harappans are the Vedic people, the Rigvedic people, and so on, which there's not much evidence for that at all. So some of those things are definitely problematic. So that's that's what I wanted to talk about. One other thing, slightly moving on from the history of places or lands and so on. So a couple of things that I wanted to touch upon is, one is around the history of language itself. So language is something that is of great interest for me. And then recently I read this book called the Unfolding of Language, the evolution of mankind's greatest invention. And this is a very well written book. I mean, there are of course some parts of it which are quite technical and so on, but what you sort of, I mean, of course, the focus here is, I mean, although there is an overall focus, but it's still more around European language, and more specifically on English and so on. But it's sort of how it sort of basically the author brings up the underpinnings of how languages evolve, right? So how do these structures of languages come to be? How do the sound shifts happen, right? How do we sort of, when we say there is a proto form of a language, and then when they start deviating and then start becoming different languages within a family, or when the different families that get created, what sort of processes happen, and how long does this take, and then so it's a very good account of all of that, right? And of course there's a lot of different anecdotes he provides, not just from English, but also from other languages. For example, from Arabic, so he talks about what is a basic structure. For example, Arabic has this structure where there are these consonant clusters, right? Like typically of three sort of characters, and then when you sort of start placing vowels around them, basically the consonant structure takes on a base meaning. Depending on where you place the vowels, it takes, you form new words, all of whose at the base level have the same sort of underlying meaning, but then there's a lot of, it sort of the number of combinations that just increases. And so for example, the consonant cluster like SLM is basically indicates, I think, either love or mercy, one of those. But now if you look at it, so if when you place an A and I between, then it becomes Salim or Salma or Islam, right? Or Islam, any of those, Muslim, any of those, basically the underlying thing is at SLM. So like that, the number of things, and it sort of traces the history of these different, how the Germanic tribes came in, and how the sort of English language wanted to, how this contractions of words and then expansion and then building language by analogy, all of that takes place. It's a very fascinating book, that traces the history of languages.
So on the same topic, another book that is highly recommended is it's called How Language Began by Daniel Everett. Although Everett's book is slightly more, is a lot more technical. Guy Doster's book is that way a lot more approachable, a lot more readable. Yeah.
Technical.
Sorry, Adi, I missed what you said.
No, I said I started How Language Began, and then I think Kapil mentioned this unfolding of language, so I kept that aside and thinking that
And you started reading this.
You mentioned.
Okay, you mentioned it.
He's reading, he mentioned.
Yeah. So, like I said, history of so many subjects. So, Mandar, I know you've been reading the history of cooking and food and agriculture. So, do you want to share about that? Because I've been hearing about it in bits and pieces, but maybe it would be a good time now,
Sure.
to.
So yeah, not agriculture. I won't go there because that is a separate,
Okay.
history by itself. But yes, I would love to talk about the history of food, and there are a couple of very good books that I've been reading. So actually, I've kind of tried to put together the history of spice trade, and how different cuisines kind of evolved to where they are today. And in that effort, I kind of touched upon some 4 or 5 different books. So I'll make a reference to those books, but I'll generally just talk about the history itself overall, right? So let me begin with this book called Curry, right? This is a book by a British historian called Lizzie Collingham. She writes very well. It's a very informative book. The only thing I kind of am disappointed with in this book is that it's written not for an Indian audience at all. It's written so the British audience, right? Or maybe even a Western audience, maybe American also be able to relate with it. But it's certainly not for an Indian audience. So in this book, she starts off, basically taking 2 main historical characters, right? The first is Vasco da Gama, and the second is Babar. And she kind of posits that in a space of 28 years, right? So Vasco da Gama landed here in 1498, and then Babar landed here about 28 years later. 1526, he crowned himself the king, right? So the advent of these 2 people into this land had a great impact on the evolution of cuisines and food, right? So let's quickly talk about the story of Vasco da Gama. So it's not that the Europeans got introduced to spices like pepper and cardamom and cinnamon and so on after Vasco da Gama came to India. That's not true. Right? So they always had a spice route to India via Turkey, and Turkey, Afghanistan, Iran, and so on. But and this European palate is very used to, by the 15th century, they are very used to these spices, and their own cuisine is highly influenced by some of these spices. But then in the 15th century, there is a very important development, which is that the Ottoman Empire, right, takes hold of Turkey and North Africa, right? So A quick look at the map will make it very clear. But what happens is that Europe's access to India and this side of Asia gets completely cut off because Turkey and North Africa and everything in between the sea is seized, right?
Yeah.
That entire area is seized. I mean,
The Mediterranean, basically.
the Mediterranean, exactly. So the Moorish provinces and the Turkish provinces are completely taken by the Ottomans.
Hmm.
This is the real problem. So now the Europeans are used to these wonderful spices, the long pepper, the peppercorns, and cardamom, and so many other spices, but they now don't have a route through which to bring it into mainland Europe, right? So that is when they start, their efforts towards discovering sea routes. And the first effort is by the Spaniards. When Christopher Columbus says, okay, I need to get to the west. So what I'm going to just do is keep sailing east because the earth is like a ball. So if I just keep sailing east, eventually I'll reach India. And so he set sail, and sure enough, when he sailed east, he did reach some islands, right? He reached the Caribbean islands. And there, sure enough, he found, something that they grow there, which tastes very similar to the taste that have been described to him. Oh, it's very, very peppery and it's pungent and basically the spicy taste. And he gets it, and he's like, oh, so I found India. What he has actually found is the Caribbean, and the spice that he has tasted is really the chili, right? It's not the pepper. India had not seen chili till then. There was no chili there. So what the Europeans were used to for pungency, for heat, was the pepper. But this guy found the chili. He found it in the Caribbean, right? And he believed he'd found the Indies, right? And which is how the West Indies or the Caribbean got discovered, whatever, right? The discovery of the new world and all the Western world calls it. So, and later on, the Spaniards realized that what they had discovered was in fact the chili, the capsicum, the species capsicum. And in fact, one of the species of chili called capsicum annuum, right, was very regularly consumed in one of the Spanish occupied areas, which is Mexico, right? And in fact, the word chili comes from the Aztec word for that fruit, that vegetable, that spice, whatever, right? So they basically appropriated the spice, they appropriated the name, right? And chili became a word that was commonly accepted as an English word, right? But they still not found the peppercorns, right? So they found chili, but not the other spices, which is when Vasco da Gama said, okay, let's forget about sailing east. Let's talk to the other sailors and find out what they say. And most of them advised him to sail south. And that is how he skirted Africa and basically took a U-turn at the Cape of Good Hope and landed at the coast of Kerala. And the rest, as they say, is history. So, so Lizzie Collingham's book goes into a great amount of detail about how much of spice was exported out of India, how much spice Vasco da Gama and subsequent sailors took out of India in each shipment, and up to the order of a few megatons of peppercorns and long pepper sailed out of India in every trip, right? But one of the things that happened was that in exchange, the Europeans brought the chili into India, right? And that is again, as they say, the rest is history, because within just a few decades, the chili became a very integral part of most cuisines in the south, to the extent that even Purandaradasa wrote a poem about it, right? He wrote a poem called Vahavahare Mensinakkai. Okay, and so Purandaradasa lived in the 15th, 16th centuries, and the Vasco da Gama came here in 1498. So I can't imagine that Purandaradasa wrote about the chili several decades later. It must have been just about 30, 40 years. And he talks about how it basically became the savior of the poor, essentially, because it suddenly made the dry, tasteless bread a lot more attractive, right? A lot more consumable. So anyway, So that is one line of story. And then she talks to you about how the how the advent of certain other dishes from Europe, like the vindaloo, for example, right? The vindaloo basically is sort of a portmanteau of two words, vigno and aglio. Vigno is wine vinegar, and aglio is garlic, right? So the Portuguese, when they came to Goa, they brought the vindaloo with them, but they discovered that the Indians don't make wine vinegar, right? We did have garlic by then, though. So then the cooks of the south said, okay, let's use tamarind water instead, right? And that's how then they started adding chili to it, and that's how the vindaloo as we know it today kind of evolved, right? The other aspect of the story is, 28 years later, 28 years after Vasco da Gama came in, Babur kind of coming into North India, right? So Babur he's basically a fifth generation descendant of Timur or Tamerlane, various other names that was known by. Fifth generation descendant. So basically a tribal leader from Samarkand, right? His dream was to really re-establish the Timurid line, right? And the Timurid empire, create an empire there. And he did manage to capture a particular area of Samarkand, but the Uzbeks again threw him out. So he had to get out of there. And then he eventually came to India. Now, the thing about Babur is that he, unlike many of the previous Muslim invaders who came into India, this was a guy with a very fine palate, with a taste for art, with a taste for wine. Some might say a little too much of a taste for wine. He was known for excessive drinking, except when he went into battle. He used to stay away from wine when he went into battle. So this guy, basically wanted, he loved food, right? So he, in his autobiography, in the Baburnama, he starts writing about various recipes. He starts writing about, of course, many of these books are about administration, how what needs to be done in order to rule a kingdom. It's about battle, preparation for battle. It's about veterinary sciences. It's about medicine and so on. But then there's also a section always dedicated to food, right? So he writes about food, and then his successors, especially Akbar, not Akbar, who wrote Aini Akbari? Abul Fazl wrote Akbari, and in that he talks about a particular dish known as the birinj, the zard birinj. Zard is yellow in Hindustan.
Zard is yellow, yeah.
Yeah, so the yellow birinj is basically, it seems like it was the less spicy version of the biryani, right? And that is where the biryani seems to have taken root in India, but it has its roots actually in Persia, right? It seems to be a dish that was perfected in the streets of Baghdad, erstwhile Persia. Baghdad was known to be part of Persia at the time. And from there it went into Turkey as pilav, became pilaf in some regions, went to Spain as the paella, and ended up in Awadh as again the pulav, right? And then the Awadhs seem to have kind of evolved their own version of the curry known as the korma, which is a lot more richer than the almond paste and the garlic based curry of the Mughals, right? So this is a book that goes into a fair amount of detail about all of this. And in fact, she talks to you about, the level of detail to me is a little astonishing, because she says, how does the name Mughal, where does the name Mughal come from, for instance? It's a very interesting theory. I did not know this before. On his father's side, Babur is a fifth generation descendant of Timur. But on his mother's side, he is a 15th generation descendant of Genghis Khan, right? And the Europeans, just because they knew he was a descendant of Genghis Khan and therefore had Mongol descent, decided to call them Mughals. So Mughal is derived from Mongol, right? So that's the level of detail she had. She even talks to you about how Akbar, in his in his behavior and in his day-to-day life, became more and more Hindu by the day, right? including rumors that a Brahmin priest used to be lowered on a charpai to his window, and from where he used to give sermons to the king at night. A lot of detail like this, but surprisingly, well, rather unsurprisingly, when it comes to any mention of South India, and this whole story begins in South India, she seems to run out of details, right? Ask her about Babur and Akbar and Awadh, and she has a ton of details for you, but she won't refer to Purandaradasa, right? She just says, a South Indian poet wrote about the chili and called it the savior of the poor. Now, to me, that's a poorly researched book, right? And for a book that kind of makes the entreaty that the world should not look at Indian cuisine as one monolithic entity, and that there are actually several cuisines within India, right? You again seem to be representing to the rest of the world that Indian cuisine is largely just Mughlai cuisine, and the rest of the details do not matter, right?
Adi has a very knowing smile there.
Yeah. So, while she was outraging about William Dal Rinpoche, I was outraging.
I know, exactly. That's what I say.
So
Very
if I may just take about 3 or 4 minutes, if that's all right.
Yes, yeah. With that, then we'll wind up.
What I was saying.
Okay.
We have some sessions.
Yeah, finish what you're saying.
All right.
We can wrap it.
Yeah. So, so in this book again, she talks about how the idea of dum pokht and the various styles of cooking came about. So there was a famine in 1784 that hit Awadh, right? And the Nawab of Lucknow at the time, Asafud-Dawla, basically gave employment to people to build the Bada Imambara, right? And for the laborers who worked there, he told his cooks that hot food should be made available to them whenever they want, right? So the cooks were now forced to invent a method of cooking that would keep food hot at all times, and that's how cooking food in its own steam, using the dum method into being, and the invention of the shami kebab because the Nawab was toothless, and so on. Several stories like that. But again, the one bone I have to pick with her is that for her, India is North India. She doesn't have too many details about the rest of India at all. But she does seem to make references to one text, right? Manasollasa, which was a Sanskrit text, basically written in verse, Sanskrit verse, in the 12th century by this Kshatriya king, Chalukya king called Someshwara III, right? So Someshwara III, and again, it's just a reference, one reference to Manasollasa and done, right? And it's kind of ironic that she's writing a book on curry, but she won't really go into detail about the Manasollasa, because the Manasollasa and another text which predates Manasollasa called Lokopakara actually contain lots of recipes for different types of curries, right? And she won't even reference Lokopakara for that matter. So in that sense, I find that this book is a lot more better researched. It's called Feasts and Fasts: A History of Food in India by Colin Taylor Sane.
Okay.
A much better researched book. And there's one more called How to Make a National Cuisine. Yeah, this was published in 1988, I believe. Arjuna Padurai is the writer. So these two are better researched books in my opinion. So Manasollasa, Someshwara talks about, it's because he's a Kshatriya king, he's not bound by any rules of of the Brahmins and so on. So he talks about eating meat, he talks about game birds, deer, wild boars, goat, but surprisingly there is no mention of fowl, there's no mention of chicken or beef, right? So I don't know, maybe around the 12th century it still wasn't a part of the cuisine or something. And very interestingly, the spice that he references the most is hing, asafoetida, right? And the history of asafoetida itself is very interesting. In fact, Sanket had shared one Twitter thread about this a few days ago. It just so happens that I have the book that thread was based on. It's called The Flavor of Spice by Mariam Reshi, right? So where she describes the history of various spices, and the one on the chapter on asafoetida is absolutely beautiful. So this guy talks about, and by this guy I mean Someshwara, talks about like 8 different varieties of rice, like some 7 different kinds of pulses, 25 different kinds of leafy vegetables, 35 different kinds of fish and so on. And when you read about this text, I haven't read the Manasollasa, but I've read about it. Kind of what's it called, the history of some of the prominent South Indian dishes starts becoming clear to you. For example, he talks about a very thin pastry called mandaka, which is very similar to the mandige that is made in Karnataka, Maharashtra, and Goa region. Similarly, you hear about purika, which is puri, vadika, which is actually Uddin Vada is talking about. Yeah. Then there's doshika, which is dosa. But he also describes some eccentric dishes like barbecued rats, and very interesting. And this book contains recipes for kebabs, right? He doesn't mention kebabs, of course, but he talks about minced meat, mixing spices, and then kind of putting it around a skewer and grilling
barbecuing
it. Right, barbecuing or grilling it. It's essentially the kebab, but no, Miss Calling.
The stomach is rumbling now. I said the stomach is rumbling now.
Sorry to cut in.
Right. I
overshot the time a little bit. Are we close to wrapping up the session?
Yeah. We'll just end it with this note. Ruqayya, 2 minutes more. Right?
So I'm almost done here. So the other text is Lokopakara, which is a Kannada text in the 11th century by this Jain poet called Chaundaraya, again in Chalukya court. And he also talks about, he talks about 57 different recipes, right? But look, the problem with these Western writers writing about some of the older Indian texts is, now the 57 recipes that Chaundaraya gives in Lokopakara, right? They have been called rudimentary by Colin Taylor Sen. And the reason they have been called rudimentary recipes is because he doesn't make use of onion or garlic. He's a Jain, he's a Jain poet, right? And he perhaps doesn't cook with onion and garlic, but so that is why his recipes get labeled as rudimentary. But that text describes, for example, a recipe for cooking rice. He says rice must be washed thrice and then boiled in a lot of water, which is still the accepted way of cooking rice.
Making rice.
In those places, right? He talks about the raunde, kajaya, shikarni. For the first time, finds a mention in that text. And in general, in Indian cuisines, there isn't a lot of effort made to make vegetarian food look like non-vegetarian food. That is something typical of the Chinese. For example, they'll make something called a tofu duck and everything. So, vegetarians who want to eat duck can eat the tofu, for example. But there is one exception. There seems to be just one exception. And it is that in Lokopakara, Chaundaraya describes, how you make a vada that looks like a fish and can be made to look like it has the texture of a fish. I think I've bored people enough, so let me just stop.
No, you've just left us hungry. That's it.
One more book I'd like to recommend is this one. Kind of describes how.
So sorry, Mandar. I'm really sorry about this, but we really don't have the time. What we can do is, if you guys are okay with it, we can shift it to Google Meet.
I think we'll wind up now on that note. Yeah. Chalo, thank you guys. Thank you very much. I know it's been a little longer than usual, and I think, like I said, history is so vast that one session just cannot do justice to any of this. Anyway, on that note, thank you very much. And I think the next week's team will announce on the group.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Later on. Okay, so we sign out.
Yeah.
Thank you.
With the promise for next month. Bye-bye.